About a year into starting playing guitar, I was looking for a new amp. I had started with an old practice PV amp from the 80s. Quite frankly, didn't sound very good. I went to a store called Parkway Music, and I wanted something that had a good reverb and sounded great clean, but was loud enough to go over a drummer. And I'm not quite sure why I remember this so vividly, but I saw this amp under a Fender Sherwood Green 1962 Stratocaster reissue. It was all the way on the ground with two other amps, which I can't remember, that were on top of it. I asked for help. I took it into the little demo/practice room. I fell in love immediately. And even now, 20 years into my journey as a guitar player, this is my clean amp. Now, I recently got this amp back. It was in storage in New York while I was living in California. I moved, and my parents brought it down with them in the first initial shipment of things. And it got me to thinking, after playing it, it's just as good as I remember. It's fantastic. So why aren't these things worth more money? So today, I'm going to be going over a little bit of the history of the company and trying to assess just why these things haven't skyrocketed in value in current day market. In 1965, Leo Fender sold Fender musical instruments to CBS. Part of that agreement included a non-compete, which meant he wasn't going to be able to set up shop right around town immediately. He'd have to wait 10 years to put his name on anything that would be directly a competitor to Fender. In 1971, Tom Walker, Forrest White, and Leo Fender started a company called Trisonic, which would become Music Man. And in 1975, Leo Fender was named the president of the company. Now here's where things start to get a little cloudy. Apparently, it was Tom Walker who was in charge of all of the amps and the design of those. Leo was busy working on the basses and the guitars. Now it is important to remember here, at this time in music history, these amps needed to be loud. They were marketed as not having to be needed by a PA system or anything like that. You wanted to just, in theory, put your guitar on a stage and be able to play almost any venue. And before I start addressing the design of Music Man amps and their hybrid nature, it's important to remember, Fender themselves, they wanted to build the cleanest possible amps for their customers. Now, upon first glance, you would look at the 212 HD Music Man amp that I have and think, looks just like a twin reverb. But this is where the major deviation happens, and where I believe part of the reason they're not worth as much money now as other old vintage amps. The preamp, solid state. Now, because of all of the cheap solid state amps that were produced in the late 90s and early 2000s, actual design has gotten a bad rap amongst the guitar community. When they were designing this, they could have very easily used power tubes in the preamp section, but they deliberately decided not to. So why? By opting for the solid state preamp design, it would allow them to use a lower voltage, and also that would create less energy. Less energy creates less heat. This, in theory, would mean the tubes would become a lot more reliable and last a lot longer. And if you've ever kicked around a guitar store, I'm certain you've seen a modern hybrid style, but they're very different. Those use a 12AX7 or similar preamp tube, while having the power section be solid state. This makes it a lot easier to achieve those high gain sounds. So when you really break it down, it makes a lot of sense why Leo Fender and Music Man would opt for the solid state in the preamp. They wanted clean. That was the priority. Now, switching gears to the power section, these used 6C A7 tubes, which are pin compatible with EL34s, which is what Marshalls used at the time. Fender was still using 6L6 or rarely 6V6 tubes for their power sections. The rectifier was solid state, while Fender was still using tubes. Now, when you use a tube rectifier, it kind of softens the sound a little bit. When you use solid state, it's a little bit more punchy and in your face, and I have to say, I love that about this amp. Now, some people will point to the fact that there were a few models that did have a 12AX7 tube, but that was for the phase inverter. These amps also could be put into a low power mode. However, it was implemented differently than most are done. Instead of turning off some of the tubes in the power section, this does it by reducing the voltage that powers the tubes themselves. All of the early Music Man amps were 2 channels. On the second channel, you did have an option to use a reverb and a tremolo, just like you could on a twin or a deluxe reverb. However, the sound is different, and it may have more to do with the actual circuit design than the reverb itself, as they were basically based on the same Accutronics. And as far as the speakers go, Music Man used Eminence, originally square magnets on the back, changing out to round ones later on. And now that we've gone over all the specifications and kind of tech parts of the amps, in practice, these were received very well by a lot of players. Albert Lee, Mark Knopfler, Eric Clapton himself used Music Man amps as their live gigging amps for quite some time. Internally, there were a lot of arguments going on behind the scenes as far as the management goes. And this led to the company being sold to Ernie Ball in 1984. Now, while I was doing my research for this video, I stumbled across a thread in TDPRI. The owner and founder of Legend Musical Instruments claims to have met Leo Fender at the NAMM show in 1980. He complimented the Music Man amp, and Leo did not seem happy about it. He claimed that he said the design was backwards, meaning the preamp should have been a tube, and the power amp should have been a solid state. He also went on to say he had nothing to do with the actual design of the amplifiers, then carried on talking about other things. So take for that what you will. Alright, so brief history lesson aside here, where does that leave us? Why are they so cheap? I think you have to consider what the modern guitar player wants and what the modern guitar companies are producing. These amps are extremely loud and they're extremely heavy. In an era where everything seems to be getting smaller and using lower wattage and less tubes, maybe they just don't have the same spot. They're not that practical. They do sound great, but there are trade-offs that are involved. And I think it does need to be said that many potential customers may be well turned off because of the solid state preamp section, looking for something more Fender vintage from that era. And while the design, the weight, and the volume may be valid concerns, we do live in the golden age of gear, and there are ways around this so you can still get that incredible Music Man tone. Get yourself an attenuator. There you go. All set to go. So my advice would be, do yourself a favor. If you ever see one of these listed locally, they're steal for the money. They do have their share of the headaches that have been mentioned, but all in all, the tone is well worth it, especially considering how cheap they are. And I'd like to mention my own personal experience. I've never had a problem with this amp. I've had this amp for 20 years. Gigged out with it, cranked it for studio sessions. Never, ever had a problem. The design is very reliable, at least for me. And I'd like to close this out by thanking the people at Mark Knopfler Guitar, TDPRI, and the Music Man Amp forums. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to find all this information. And it's crazy to think, for a company that had one of the founders as the legendary Leo Fender, how hard it is to find some of this information. If you like what I'm doing, please leave me a like. Leave me a comment. Let me know what your experience with Music Man amplifiers are. Subscribe if you haven't. Other than that, I'll see you tomorrow for another guitar-related video. Take care, you guys.